independence. There is a real nice chocolatey, pregnant area that we're talking about in general before as an example about politics. But first consider for a second, were it not for the necessary flab, the ineptitude, the shortness of breath that it must take on to become a word, consider what would be possibly the beauty of independence, independent thinking. Once it does become a word, it presents certain, shall we say, unnecessary difficulties to someone attempting to be independent. But consider what a beauty it would be if it could be. Not in the sense, of course, that ordinary people, as we mentioned, try to use it. They're not dumb, but it's because of the polarized nature, where it's either got to be chocolate or vanilla and etc., that the word independent, and all of its many synonyms, but some of the more common ones that even we mention now and then, that the intellect ordinarily wants to think about, at least some parts of society. And if you talk to them, many people, oh, all right, if I talk to them long enough, I could make all the people that were sober and not Presbyterians admit to something along these lines. If I said, would it not be, amongst other boons you might experience in life, would it not be good if you could be intellectually independent, if you could be objective, if you could be truly scientific and not just limited to the sciences, but if you could be scientific? Now anyone, an automobile mechanic, anyone, well, I was just trying to take something that was nice and apparently fairly removed from the great walls, not of China, academia. And yet anyone, if it was presented to him just for a second, would say, yes, that would be of great benefit. And yet it is impossible. It is literally as impossible as saying 2 and 2 could be 4, and 2 and 2 could be 5, and 2 and 2 could be 3. As you all know, and it has nothing to do with mathematics, actually. It has to do with the nature of the polarized energy that fuels three-dimensional, what do they call it? It starts with a C, not Canton. You're still thinking about China, see. Consciousness. I knew you'd get it. So, if you've got an interest in something, you've already got an interest in it. If your energy line, if your kind of genetic tie-in to the life of humanity is such that you have any interest in an area, the interest cannot be, no matter how anyone wants to describe it, no matter how they want to theorize about tomorrow, all you got to do is check with your own operations. Then the intellect cannot be impartial about the matter. It cannot be in some way truly independent of the area, of its ramifications, of its peripheral sparks. It simply cannot be. Having admitted all of that, from a new view, from a revolutionary view, still, notwithstanding the warts and limitations and the panning of language, which we still cannot escape, I was going to attempt to get you to consider what might be reasonable descriptions of something that the revolutionary intellectual would mean by independent, an independent thought, if he used such a term. And I made him up, so by God, he'll use it. So don't worry about that. If you ever meet one, he'll use it. From a revolutionary view, an independent, and you can take all these operationally synonymously, whether we be speaking verbally or nounly. An independent, like an independent political person, as opposed to the Labor Party or the Whigs or the Tories or the Christian Democrats, are independent thinking. Now, what would be, I suggest to you, meant by that, as opposed to the fallacious, though well-intended ideas of objective and clinical and scientific, what a revolutionist would actually be referring to. Well, first let me point out a few negatives, since everyone likes that. I know people keep writing and say, when are you going to talk about that? And I say, what? See, because you lost the train of thought about why it is that negative examples seem so, may I say, piercing? All right, poignant. But let me say first, look at from sort of a negative way of what a revolutionist mode of thought might mean by independence, or being independent of thought, if it were possible. Well, for one thing, it would not mean that you were in some way hostilely separate. For another thing, which in the Western world, I guess those using Arabic numbers could be considered a two thing. For another thing, it would not be that you were in some way shut out and wanting in. Being independent would not be being perplexed or undecided. Being independent would not be being envious of the apparent preeminent modes, the two major forces. And I guess, well, let me at least end this little bit with a non-negative. And all of that, but still, a revolutionist would mean by being independent or independent of thought would not mean that he or she would be without passionate interest in life. It would be that when a revolutionist said to himself, independent, what he'd mean is just independent, which is what I tried suggesting initially to those of you that do not take so kindly to suggestions. For you, we have whips and chains, and I have inherited Gunther Williams' chair, so we do not have to deal in subtleness forever. That was what I was suggesting would be the beauty if you could think outside ordinary grasp of polarized. But what would it be to be independent? Now, even at a childish, fairly crude level, most people would relish the idea in some way of being independent. Of course, most people, I guess, would think financial. Or, boy, wouldn't it be great that you didn't have to take any crap off of a boss, that you didn't have anybody say, why are you late? And then I guess they could expand it into everyday affairs. Wouldn't it be great in some way to be, or maybe so big, that you could walk in and there was a line waiting to get their driver's license or to be served at the bar. You don't even have to say something like, excuse me. You just walk through and you just knock people out of the way. But they try and look. They say, pardon me for being in your way. Or that you look so ferocious, or there's some sort of mystical eminence emanates from you that you can pull up where it says reserved for the handicapped and Republicans, and you can just park there, and a policeman will be looking right at you and tip his hat. Somewhere along those lines, ordinary people would consider, yeah, independent. If in some way you're independent, to them it's just you would not have to take any crap off life, which is what they mean. I would not have to get any kind feedback in my energy connection to life. Which, nothing wrong with that. That's a dream of going to heaven. Or at least Lauderdale, if you got enough money to retire. There is a real beauty that you can almost smell, that ordinary people can, in a sense, smell, is why they would be so taken by the idea of independent freedom. Everything, all the way throughout history, the ideas religious, political, social, sexual. You know, back when men were in charge like the gods intended, Men thinking, boy, wouldn't it be great that all the women that I liked would be attracted to me and they'd stay home and never, wouldn't stick their head out the door, and I could go out and do anything I wanted to. All the way from, I was trying to cover the gambit for you, all the way from politics to religion to sex. If you ever say freedom, which is a reasonable synonym for independence, but if you said freedom, everybody's ears perk up. It is not possible, there's no sense talking about it. It is a relative matter for secondary avocational discussion in life when people talk about freedom. And that's, of course, of no concern of what we're concerned with here. But even the relative hobbyification of freedom, of debating it, of discussing it, of dreaming about it, of complaining you got too little, somebody else has got too much, it is a very interesting umbrella topic because you can drag in all primary areas from food, shelter, sex, and all secondary activities you can bring into the idea of freedom, and of course you can always bring it down if you're as philosophical as a good body and fender man, automobile mechanic. You can bring it down to the good area. Do we have any actual personal freedom of not? Do we have any freedom of will? Are we doing what we want to do? Are we being run by some kind of blind genetic code? And if so, how come I'm even allowed to consider the question, wait a minute, I'm getting dizzy? The idea, it strikes something, not psychologically, because it strikes something at the level of physics, the electrical area in man's brain, of the idea of independence. For one thing, I wasn't going into this, but if you want, rather than me just keep saying it strikes people, I've given you enough examples, I would just point out that one of the operational reasons, ephemerally for the night, that you consider why it strikes men is that freedom is also operationally synonymous with the future. Well, from any 3D view, even somebody as low down the celestial evolutionary pole as, I won't say it, you fill in the blank, somebody you don't like. Even they will admit that, wait a minute, the past is over and done with. There's nothing we can do about it. And right now, if there is a right now, I don't know what to do right now. I'm kind of confused. So, the idea of freedom. If you ask somebody, right now, are you free? Well, I don't know. Why do you ask? You upset me. The only way that the three-dimensionally limited, contained mind has any idea of freedom has got to be the future. So I'll leave that with you for the time being. Back to what we were talking about. How about just remember, I may not go into them in any great detail, but the kinds of things I said that a revolutionist would not be meaning and inferring and defining by his use of the word independent. Because I was going into a more positive side. The reason I listed those negatives is simply the basis that ordinary people, I was going to be subtle and leave it with you, but we've got 2 or 3 extra minutes, so I'll unsubtle it a bit. Is you're supposed to see that that is the way ordinary people operate. That is, that's the way that your intellect would operate regarding the idea of freedom. I just turned around and said what an ordinary, or what a revolutionist would mean by the word independence, and being in some way independent of thought would not be. You see, now I listed those things, but you were supposed to put it together and realize, well, that is the extent. If I dreamed of freedom at the old building site here, that's all I could do. Or if I thought about with somebody else that were out there running at the barricades and hollering about freedom, in almost any context, I would, at the old level, I would analyze them as being captive of the very things that I said that a revolutionist would not mean. Was that clear enough? Well, are you trying to be a smartass? All right. Just think about the ones I mentioned that a revolutionist would not mean that they were in some way hostilely separate. Because many times when people say and dream and write about freedom, independence, it is a basis, their kind of dream of in some way that I would be separate from something they're going to be talking about. A church, a religion, a political system. And need I even have to add the adjective hostilely separate? Because if you had no sort of animosity toward whatever it is that you believe that you'd be seeking independence and freedom from, you wouldn't even think about it, right? So there's always a certain degree, shall we say, why not, of hostility. But a real revolution wouldn't mean that. That would not be independence. You're back in the same old trap of, I'll never forgive my mother for what she did to me. Well, why don't you talk to her about it? Oh, she's been dead 30 years. You wouldn't call that? You wouldn't be tempted to ask this person, assuming it wasn't you, and of course you wouldn't ask yourself such a personal question, to ask the person, you don't think that 30 years of being, I assume, completely out of touch with your dear departed mother does not in some way create a certain kind of independence? I mean, what do you want? I mean, to push it a little bit further, all my life I've been set upon. I grew up next to this guy called Bubba Fishmeyer, and he used to always beat me up and take away my lunch. He's made my life miserable. I mean, I've still got permanent scars. My little finger won't bend like that because of what he did to me. You say, well, why don't you're grown now. Why don't you call the police or take a warrant out? Oh, Bubba died when we were both 17. And so you think, well, wait a minute. You're freed from Bubba. By God, you're right. I knew you told me that he's been dead since you were 17. And you're what now? 47? Don't make me figure it out. So has it been roughly, may I suggest, has it been roughly 20 years since Bubba inflicted any sort of dominance over you? Now that you mention it, yeah. And then you could say, sir, may I be the first to tell you, I believe that you are free from Bubba. I assume that sounded silly. If it didn't, turn to another channel. But that is, what's the difference between that? I just take it physically. That whatever it was that you thought was in some way a captor of you physically is gone. Who is going to say, what reasonable, sane person in the city is going to say, the greatest hindrance to my freedom is a man who's been dead 20 years ago that used to beat me up? Well, what's the difference between that and, of course, ordinary people would say, well, there is a difference. What's the difference between that? It's still electrical, chemical. And, of course, ordinary people say, don't give me that crap. We're talking about gods and psychology and stuff. And so, with the other hand, I go, those are Freudian symbols for those of you that... Freud was no, he wasn't Italian. He went to Italy once. That's where he picked that up. They would say, well, there is a difference between my father or my mother, someone being dead, and me still worried, being concerned, caught up in the kind of psychological intrigues that normally go on amongst many families. And so just to say, well, my mother's dead, and therefore I no longer have any concern over the way she mistreated me, or conversely, the way I mistreated her, and I feel guilty, and I can't bring her back, and I can't apologize, that there is a great deal of difference between that and Bubba, who just simply used to beat me up and take my lunchbox and sit on it and mash my sandwiches. Just because he's dead, you're right. Now that you point out, because Bubba, I didn't give a damn about him personally. It wasn't like he was kin. So I don't care that he's dead, but now that you point out, and he didn't really bother me psychologically, he bothered me physically. He wasn't my hero. I didn't care what he thought about me. All I cared was, Bubba, leave me the hell alone. But now you're right. He has left me the hell alone for 20 years, and since you point out, I believe that is due almost entirely to the fact that he's dead. All right. But wait a minute, there's a difference between that and the kind of continuing psychological, spiritual, tango, dance of frustration, guilt that I do with my mother. If you say so, I will not call any decent city person a liar. I won't call anybody a liar. So having been found out, I guess we should just stop this tape. Since I have now, for the basis of every other sane person pointed out, I must admit a sort of captious and subtle, but still obviously flaw in all of this. I don't see any sense in pressing on. Okay. But notice the ones, run back over them real quick, of what a revolutionist would not mean by independence, which I still suggest you are the sorts of things I was just trying to pull the good old, turn your toupee over and people wonder whether you're actually sprouting new hair or trying to send out some sort of subtle signal. But so instead, I'm just saying it in a negative way, but notice this is the foundations of how ordinary people would look at and think about independence, freedom, and all of its various synonyms. That the revolutions would not mean, infer that it would be, in some way, a situation of being hostilely separated from something, someone, some group, some institution, some idea, some epoch. It would also not be a variation of that, a feeling that I have in some way been shut out and won't in. Which the good old crude version of that is that you wanted to play hopscotch and stuff, and Bubba and his friends wouldn't let you play. They were a weird group of guys named Bubba doing hopscotch, and so therefore you kept trying to play and they kept pushing away, and finally you went, yeah, boy, I hate anybody that play hopscotch is probably a sissy. I wouldn't want to play hopscotch. And of course, in the city, psychologically oriented people would say, now we're wise to that. Kid that sticks out his tongue says, I don't want to play, is hurt. They feel shut out and they won't in, and so they just go. See, that is part of what many people at the ordinary level would mean by freedom and independence. Is we should do away with the king. We should do away with this tyrannical government. And according to how you're watching this, you can take that as being a political statement, which is not, as the king's up here. But at any rate, let's make it easy. Apparently we're talking out here is people say, well, screw the monarchy. We don't need a government. Let's be anarchists ourselves. And you find out that the anarchist, if they can pull the government down, the guy who was in front hawing the loudest, what's he going to do? First thing he's going to do, after they've plundered the palace, he'll find the old throne somewhere, and if it's still left, they burnt down most of it, but he'll fan it off. And just casually, the head anarchist, a man in the back version of the Amen corner already understands, he's just going to casually, like he wanted to sit down and rest himself for a minute, and he will just suddenly find himself next to the remnants of the throne. I didn't want to play anyway. That is not freedom. That is not independence. The other one I mentioned would not be some feeling of being perplexed or undecided, which is another sort of version of being independent. Is like, well, I see what you people are up to. I hear what you're saying. I hear where you're coming from, and I just don't care to participate. No offense, but I just rather stay freed from that or independent from that. When the point is, they're perplexed by it, which is a form of, because I don't know what's going on here. And so they announce, well, I feel somewhat impartial about this whole matter. You people, you people carry on. Maybe I'll check in with you later. Just right now, I have too many fishes to fry. My plate's full now. I don't have any particular interest right now. And they go away, thinking, what in the hell are they up to? I hope I didn't make a fool out of myself. But one way that ordinary folks could say that you can protect yourself psychologically when you're about to make a serious intellectual fox pass is sort of excuse yourself. The conversation gets too deep. They're discussing the breakup of certain areas around the Western Baltics. And so you recognize some of what the guy just said from this week's Time, and so your retort was some of what you remember from this week's U.S. News report, and he comes back with a little more that you can identify, and you can't. So you go, well, I'd like to discuss this more. I'm really interested in this, but the Balkans. I feel for the people, but when we consider the troubles going on a little further east in the Persian Gulf area, and even around some of the more rebellious areas within the USSR, I don't know. You have excused yourself, and ordinary people would say, well, that's a nice cover. Remember, we're not talking about psychology, we're talking about the nature of energy as it comes out here in talks. But it is a fact that part of what ordinary people, without having any way to analyze it, mean when they would think of freedom, independence from all sorts of ideas, is at times, in that list I gave, can be an expression of perplexion, indecisiveness. That is, they cannot plug in directly. They've got some kind of interest. The energy in some way has caught their attention, but they don't know what to do with it. That is not what would be meant from a subversive view. And it would certainly not be any form of envy over the prevailing, which is, again, sort of an extended expansion of, like, well, I bet one time I could, if I'd have studied hard and made the right moves, I could be there in the king's court. I could have been some kind of mignon somewhere, carrying around the royal chamber pot or something. But since things didn't work out, they play like, boy, who wants to be up there? Who wants to be in the inner circle? Who wants to be in such and such position? When, again, ordinary people could analyze it and say, well, that's a form of envy. That is not what a revolutionist would mean by any form of independence. Because you understand you're not independent. I was going to give, since I brought politics again, the big old fat example that we were kicking around before that I pointed out that throughout history, you would have the two prevailing modes, wherever it is, the power, the king, the loyal opposition, the pretender to the throne, or whether it's now the Democrats and Republicans, the Whigs, the Tories, the socialists and the fascists, whoever it is. You will have, continue throughout history, and in the Western world, they are oftentimes referred to and take on the name themselves of the independents. And people even identify themselves in the United States in contemporary polls if they're given a chance, whereas, as far as I know, there's no serious large party known as the independents. There may be. But people, even given a chance, identify themselves. Well, I wouldn't, to respond to your question, Mr. Roper, Mr. Gallup, no one is in a hurry. I consider myself neither a conservative nor a liberal. I consider myself, or a Democrat or Republican. I consider myself an independent. You have a place to mark that down. I like to be listed as an independent. The thing about it, do you understand that I was just going to point out verbally, I think a lot of you already saw the point, but it's just a sitting duck. Figuratively speaking, of course, a sitting target, and who amongst us can resist? Consider people who call themselves an independent in the political spectrum somewhere, at any time, any place. That is vis-a-vis the two predominant, the preeminent modes of power, which is always it. Even if it's a tyrant, there's a tyrant and all the anti-tyrants. The unloyal opposition, as he would call it. An independent cannot be independent. He couldn't call himself an independent unless he had an interest in politics. So, listen, it's not just a verbal game. The person who says, I'm an independent, they're not independent of politics. That would be independent. And it's not possible. If they were independent of some kind of attraction, not that it's good or bad, that's not the point at all. But they have a serious attraction to politics, or they would not say that they were an independent. But notice the word, as many, many times happen, is so beautifully arranged as to be even more beautifully turned inside out, and then of course you got to get around the corner of the fourth cube. The very name, yes, I consider myself independent. They may be independent of the Democrats and Republicans, the Whigs and the Tories, but they're not independent, because to be independent, you'd have to be independent of politics. And notice, whoever says they're an independent are not, they are not independent of politics, or they would not, it would never even strike them to say, I'm an independent. If you care to, think about it, and trust me, it is beauty on the hoof. Much faster and much better looking than Mr. Gallup. With such a person, they could claim that they feel some separateness from the party, you understand. But the word independent can be seen as a kind of new form of verbal emperor's clothing. That what a beauty it is that life has arranged things, at least here, those who speak the King's English and think therein, that people who are not part of the two prevailing, preeminent, dominant modes of power in any situation, whatever they're called, the pros and the cons, anyone who's outside that and still has an interest are very likely to refer to themselves assuming they pick up some other people along the way, but at least in their nascent, burgeoning stage, they are wont to refer themselves as independents, which to some other people who might be attracted to that, and even some of the people in the prevailing modes, they find an intellectual attraction to. Wouldn't that be something, to be an independent? But it is a kind of trickery, a beautiful trickery, that they are indeed not independent by the very fact that they would even come up with the name independent. Because that is somewhere, following the list I gave you, they feel hostilely shut out, they're envious. That is, they are certainly lacking no interest in politics. They are somewhere within the area that I listed that a revolutionist would not be involved with in the idea of independent. They feel envious, they feel perplexed, they feel shut out. They want in, but they are indeed not independent. They are not free from politics. And by politics now, we can make that a blank and you can just consider it, positive or negative current. Chocolate or vanilla, wet or dry, up or down. But they are not independent of it. To a more, from a verbal view, apparently positive mapping of this, I was going to give, how about some operational definitions? We're already talking about it, but now to take more of an apparently positive approach to what would be involved with being independent. All right, how about this? Only a revolutionary intelligence could have an interest in something without having a vested interest. There would only be some sort of independent thinking that could have an interest in something without having a vested interest, without having any concern over the cost. No interest in the cost. Whereas, now interest and cost, I'm assuming that you people can think somewhere beyond the street level of mentation. And we're back to what we had mentioned once or twice. Anytime you think something, it's costing. Or as Kyroots had some guy point out, or maybe he pointed out, that in this one weird universe, every time you're going to think of something new, you had to forget something you already knew. And some of you laughed. That is the nature of the closet. That is the nature of the tangible 3D world. I mean, if you got your pockets full, 27 walnuts, and you decide perhaps later on in life I might like to have at least a pecan. And as we all know, you cannot get over 27 walnuts in 2 pockets. So you're simply going to have to take 1 walnut, give it to a friend. It is a vested interest. The intellect knows it. I say knows it. It's the nature of eat, be et, live or die. Ordinary people, that is, the working of the ordinary intellect at the electrochemical level, cannot have an interest in something unless it has an interest in it. It cannot think of anything new. That is, it cannot transfer, it cannot accept, it cannot transform any new energy, that is, any new idea in the area that it has an interest, until it takes one of the walnuts out of its pocket. It has a cost. That's the cost. It is simply the nature of energy. If it takes a certain voltage, a certain amount of current to run this little appliance over here, that's it. Any less won't do, and you can't put any more into it, not have it functional. It will not operate. It has a cost. If you try to, you've got to in some way subtract, you would in some way have got to delete part of the operations of this little appliance that the current amount of current is running to get any more in. That cleared that up. Back to walnuts. Everybody understands that. Well, it's easier to picture, I'll admit that. Well, a slight variation of that kind of operational definition, put it to you another way, is that be only a willfully subversive mind could think about something new and have no concern over the cost. Now, when I say have no concern over the cost, if you could do that, it's not then that in some way that you purposefully decide, well, in that case, I'll cram a pecan into my pocket on top of it. I would hope that none of you would stop that crudely. That's not the point then, because if you know how to do it, you're not giving up a specific cost. You have moved to a new area. It's not to think of something new. It's not, now, if there was some new revolutionary idea that we've talked about here, and I said, all right, this is a great, well, let's take the idea to think more than you have to, and the full ramifications of that. It's not, whatever that means, and let's assume, just for the sake of just fairy tale, just talking, let's assume that that represents something extraordinary in the electrochemical operations of the human mind. Forget how it might, or forget beyond what it might sound like psychologically, verbally, God forbid, metaphorically. But let's assume, just for the sake for a second, that it means something extraordinary. If that be true, then at that same level, it doesn't mean that now, if this was like a walnut, that this was a pellet of energy, a burst of energy, that is, thinking more than you have to do that, at the level we're talking about revolutionarily, at a different place, that does not mean that the cost is, well, let's see, I'm going to have to give up something. I'm going to have to quit believing in charity. Or I'm going to have to give up the idea that there's a God. Or I'm going to have to give up the idea that life insurance means anything. Being in a new neural building site, so here it is. It's not that the new intellectual energy, the new neural energy, that it's not that the cost now is that you specifically have to reach back at the old spot into your pockets and pull out one idea, one series of ideas. Nay, nay, young citizens. The cost is, if you want to put it this way, the cost is every friggin' thing you knew. It's not that some way selectively, well, wait a minute, some of these ideas conflict. I'm not the staunchest defender of my parents' faith, but some of this, the ideas I believe I hear here, some of these conflict very strongly with what I believe to be very ingrained, basic, inherent, inescapable religious ideas. If that's where you are, that's it. You're just as right as you can be. And it's not in some way, well, I've got to get down and wrestle with my little, what do you call it, my brain. Because if indeed, as I suspect, that some of these ideas, and maybe one I'm thinking about I'm just sure it has some real specific use, but it is so much in conflict with the religious beliefs that I still have in me somewhere, in my soul. That always sounds good. Listen, like, it's in my soul and therefore it can't come out. You can't fool around with it. That I'll never be able to consider, to use this idea if it does have some real pragmatic validity. I cannot use it because it is so in conflict. I'm going to have to take something that is dear to me and I'll have to in some way try to pull it out and replace it. I'll have to give this up to believe that. That's ordinary. That is the cost, ordinarily. But that's not the cost to be independent. Independent is not to, I'm going to have to give up this one idea. It's to give up all damn ideas. And what else do you want? Does that cover it? That's the cost. That was, as I was bringing out last time, could life afford that kind of dear expense right now? And no matter, we could be talking in 1297 or 1642, and I could say it the same way. Can life right now afford to have a sizable number of independent people running around? And then I said, well, hell, forget that. The real question is, can you afford it? And then ordinary people would start, if they took this seriously and followed into this, then they would want to consider, wait a minute. It sounds like to me I'd have to give up my ideas of charity, or I'd have to give up my ideas of being a faithful family member. I'd have to give up my ideas of being sexually promiscuous or otherwise, or I'd have to give up my idea of finally becoming a good Lutheran. No. I mean, you're wasting time. I mean, well, you can stand there, you can enumerate these forever. And if you could trap somebody like me or somebody that you could talk to, and you can say, well, wait, am I going to have to give up so-and-so? And it doesn't matter. Once somebody starts saying, you can say yes or no. It's the same thing. Well, they say, am I going to have to give up? You can say, well, no. But you understand there's going to be no end to it. They say, well, now, wait a minute. I like this idea. I want to be an intellectual rebel myself. But am I going to have to give up my belief in God? No. Am I going to have to give up worrying about what my mother thinks about me, although she's dead? No. But you understand there's no end to it. They can go on forever. Or, it wouldn't matter. Do I have to give up my idea of a belief in a tangible God? Yes, you do. Oh, well, do I have to give up my kind of feeling for my dead parents and people? Yes. Or do I have to give up ideas that I could help the world in some way? Yes, you got to give up. Or do I have to give up worrying about that man's going to destroy? Yes, you got to. It's the same thing, though. You understand? Because there's no end to it. It's like, it's not just 27 walnuts. You got to understand that 27 walnuts are all the walnuts that are available in a finite world. And so you're there forever. That's not the cost. The real cost of the revolutionist is you just abandon that. You cannot think revolutionarily. You cannot think independently if you've still got any interest in the old area. You're not an independent. You're saying, well, I want to be free of the democratic way of life, the democratic way of thinking. I want to be free. I'll pay whatever the cost is if I can get my thought processes, my sensibilities out of the nefarious grip of the Republican attitude. That's not independence, you understand? It's not being independent from something. That's the beauty if you can see it. Real subversive independence is simply being independent. You can have an interest in something without having a vested interest, which is impossible at the ordinary level. It is electrically impossible to have an interest in something without having a vested interest. It is as impossible at the ordinary level as it is to say, I'm going to stick my finger in a hot outlet in the wall and I will not get shocked. That's the only thing I'll accept. I've got to do that, but I will not get shocked. Now, you know it's ridiculous. That's the same thing as saying, because you've got a vested interest. Electricity has a vested interest. It has got to be grounded out. You're going to be part of the process. And to say, well, no, I've got to live, and I have got to live. My one desire, I can feel it. It just burns in my soul. I have got to live with my finger in the socket, but I can't stand being shocked. I've got to be independent of the electricity. No. That is, it's not a matter that you can't pay the cost. That's not even a cost. Would you believe that we're out of time again? Yes. I guess we'll carry on. If we carry this on anymore, we'll carry on where we were. Make a, what do you call it, note. All right, pretend I cut it off.